Hey everyone, I hope your week has been magnificent so far, but get ready because it's about to get even better with the mind-blowing stories I have lined up for you next. Just wait until you hear the first story about a Homeland Security Officer who shares as much as he feels he can. And while you're here, also please like and subscribe. It helps to keep us all together. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. I was a federal law enforcement officer for many years at the Department of Homeland Security, and I can tell you that I have seen some strange things in my line of work. I've seen things that I can't even begin to explain in a way that sounds lucid. And I know that there are things out there that the general public doesn't know about. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I could get in a lot of trouble, but I will say that there are creatures out there that are not of this world. I've seen them. I can't let you know exactly where I saw them, but I can tell you a bit about what I saw once and confirm that they are not human. I'm not sure what they are, and I don't think that anyone knows for sure, but I can tell you that the government is aware of these things, and they're doing everything they can to keep it all under wraps. They don't want the public to know because they're worried that people would start shooting at anything that moved. I honestly don't blame them for trying to hide it though, because the truth is mind-boggling. Basically, we're not alone in this world. There are things out there that we don't yet have the technology to understand. They're living among us, and for the most part, in complete secrecy. Unless you've seen them for yourself, you won't believe me. So anyway, the story I feel I can tell you happened about 12 years ago when I was riding home from a particularly intense day at work. I'd been driving down the usual 4-lane road I take home for about 5 miles when I spotted a dark figure on the side of the road. It was standing on the shoulder with its back to the oncoming traffic and its head turned away from the road. I slowed down to about 20 miles an hour and rolled down my window to get a better look. I couldn't believe my eyes when I got close enough to see it clearly. Up close, I could see that it was very tall and very slender, with long arms that went almost to its knees, but with a smaller head. In a way, it looked like a tall man that was wearing a long coat, but I could see that its body was different than a man's. It stood perfectly still as I passed by and didn't turn to face me, but as soon as I passed it walked into the woods. I decided to stop and turn my car around so that I could investigate further, which, stemming from my line of work, is my natural instinct. So I drove back to where I had seen the figure and I turned the car so that I was facing the woods and shining my headlights in the direction that it went. I opened the car door and got out. I then closed the door behind me and put my hand on my gun that I always had on me and started walking towards where I had seen the thing. I didn't get far before I started hearing noises around me, everywhere. It sounded like sticks breaking, or maybe sticks being thrown. I then also started to hear a strange noise, like a scream. I stopped and turned to look, but I didn't see anything. I could still hear the noises, and I started walking towards them, and that's when I saw it. It was standing on the side of the road next to a tree that was about 20 feet from the car. I could see it perfectly. It was wearing what looked like a long coat that came down below its knees, and I honestly think it was 8 or 9 feet tall, and its head was smaller than an average man. I could see right through it, too, but I can't really describe how that looked or how that was possible, but there was no mistaking it. He wasn't solidly there, if that makes any sense. And it was obviously not human, but it was standing there looking at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just looked at it. It looked at me and then smiled this strange smile, all while the deep black eyes remained lifeless. It was a strange look, though, and I got the impression that it was on guard, like maybe protecting something. I also had a sneaky suspicion that it knew who I was. And now I was close enough that I could get a good look at the clothes, and now I could see that they looked like they were made of some type of animal hide. And I could see a strap around its waist, and another strap around its chest. I think the straps were the only things holding the garment on the body. I was only about 15 feet away now, and no idea what this was, but I knew that it wasn't human. I wasn't sure what I should do, so I just stood there and stared at it. I was still holding my gun, and I was ready to use it if I needed to. Either way, though, I didn't know if I could kill it, like if it even was alive, in the sense that we think of being alive. But I sure felt it could hurt me if it wanted to, just from the looks of it. I didn't want to take any chances, so at that point I started stepping backwards and didn't take my eyes off of it. I walked back to my car backwards the entire way, with my hand on my gun the whole time. Once I got there, I got in and drove off, but continued to look in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I'll never forget what I saw that night. I have no idea what it was, but I know that I saw something that shouldn't exist. And I also have a sneaky suspicion that it knew who I was and that I'd be driving past. August 22nd, 2018. I have always hated the woods. To be honest, if it hadn't been for me having the dogs with me, there's no way I would have been anywhere near them that time of night. I used to walk through the woods on my way home from college, but they creeped me out so much that eventually I started getting off the bus one stop later and backtracking the long way around. I mean, at least then there were streetlights. On those paths in the woods, you could hardly see where you were going half the time, or who was there with you. Anything could happen. Anyway, the only reason I started going back into the woods was a job. I'd been at college for about 2 semesters, and I was really starting to run low on cash. I'd had a job the previous summer, but it ended at the start of school, and I hadn't worked since then. I asked around to my friends to see if there was anything going on, any jobs that they knew of, and one of them suggested dog walking. Now, I know it sounds crazy, but honestly, I loved it most of the time. I've always liked animals, and except for 1 or 2 that get a bit boisterous now and again, at least the ones I had to work with were good. Basically, the job is what it sounds like. At a certain time every day, I would head to somebody's house who wasn't home, maybe on vacation or at work, collect their dogs and their leashes, and then take a whole bunch of them out for a walk to make sure they get some exercise. Anyway, you can't let the dogs off the leash in busy areas because one might run off, which would start the whole pack running. The real trick, though, is to find a piece of open ground or woods where you can let them off leash and have a proper run. And that's why I started going back into the woods again. This gave the dogs some space to run around, and I figured nothing much was going to happen if I had 6 dogs with me at a time. In fact, until that night, I actually didn't feel scared at all going into the woods so long as the dogs were with me. But now, well, I'll never go back in there again. So that night, for my nightly dog walking, I go into the woods as usual, and I let the dogs off their leashes. Most times they stay fairly close and just kind of play and jump all over each other and sniff around like dogs do. But then something changed. It's weird because you'd think that only loud sounds and noises would make you pay attention. Like when a balloon bursts or a car backfires or whatever. But did you ever realize that the same thing happens when sounds stop? When things get quiet, you notice. Like when a sound should be there but then it stops or goes away, you really get hyper-aware. Well, that's at least what happened to me. The dogs had run off ahead, but after a minute or 2, I couldn't hear them anymore, and that was weird. Anyone who has dogs will tell you they are not the quietest animals. Especially when there's a few of them together, they're all barking and yipping. But suddenly it was like they had just fallen off the face of the earth. Suddenly everything was silent. By this point, I was starting to get a bit scared, so I walked a bit more cautiously. And then as I turned the corner, I saw them, all of them together. The dogs were lying on the ground in the middle of the path, all on their backs, silent, with their bellies exposed. Now, as dog people know, this isn't just because they want a belly rub, it's a submissive thing. Like, the weaker dogs will do it in front of the alpha dogs. And it's the same thing with wolves. Anyway, I wondered what the hell they were doing, but then, well, I saw it. It wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a man. It was some kind of other thing. A thing that shouldn't be. Like it shouldn't exist, or it was made wrong. In a weird way, it almost looked stretched to me, as if it had been pulled too hard when it was formed. For almost a full minute, I stood back, frozen, standing there, my legs refusing to work. I just stood and watched. It had appeared out of the clearing from the trees on the one side of the path, and it moved in these long strides, like a man. It stood up on two legs like a human would stand, but those legs weren't human at all. They had that funny backwards arch at the joint like a dog's leg or the hind legs of a horse. And you could see that in the way the muscles moved beneath the fur that it wasn't built like a dog either. It looked unbelievably strong. It had these muscles that looked like knots of cable. Like you could tell that with one quick snap, all that energy would be released, and that it could just rip or tear apart whatever it wanted. I took all of this in, scared to stay, scared to move, just unsure of what to do. Until it looked at me. Looking back, more than anything, I remember its head. It was massive, like a dog's head with ears that jutted upwards in sharp angles, but huge and muscular. Size and the power of its overall shape reminded me more of a large predator, like a lion, like the whole body was just built to hunt. As it turned towards me, I saw its eyes, and they were yellow, and they just fixed on me like it was assessing or sizing me up. I saw more intelligence in them than you'd see in any dog. There was this look to it, like it knew it was looking at me. It knew that I'd seen it, and it knew that I couldn't outrun it. I saw its head sink down, and then all of a sudden I heard the dogs begin to bark, all of them at once. I then looked away from those yellow eyes and the teeth, and I ran. I sprinted towards the open roads with the dogs following after me, dragging their leashes. I was pushing with everything I had to get back to the road, to the light, to safety, and to people, knowing all the while, just as it knew, that if it chased me, if it chose to come after me, that I was done for. Luckily for me, it didn't. And now, as I'm sure you can imagine, when I have to take the bus, I take a different route home, one that takes me as far as possible away from the woods. April 1997, Cumberland, Maryland. A few months ago, we got a new security system for our house that included 2 mounted cameras. One was on the doorbell, and the other was a motion sensor camera that looked out over the backyard. We didn't live in a bad area or anything, but people stealing packages off of porches wasn't unheard of. And we ordered a lot of stuff from Amazon. We also had 2 dogs, and when the camera detected motion, we got a notification. Soon our dogs figured out that they could activate the backyard sensor to let us know that they wanted back inside. We had a huge yard in a rural area, so we let them out to run around the yard whenever they wanted. This new system worked out pretty well. At least until something started tripping our camera at all hours of the night. The little dinging notification would wake me or my husband up a few times a week, and it drove us crazy. At first, we just turned our phones off at night once the dogs were inside, but we were definitely still curious about what was out there. We tried watching the video, but the quality wasn't great in the dark, and we never saw anything clearly. Sometimes we thought we saw a blur at the edge of the yard, but it could have been a shadow or anything, really. So we gave up and started to ignore the notifications. A month later, one of our dogs came home injured. He had some bloody scratches and bite marks, and we freaked out. We rushed him to the vet to get him all patched up, and luckily he was going to be okay, but the vet gave him a bunch of shots just in case. When we asked what had done it, the vet was stumped. He said the bite marks were vaguely canine, but too big to be a domestic dog. They didn't quite match anything he was familiar with. For a while after that, we were really careful about keeping them close to the house. We watched them at all times in the yard and didn't let them stay out long. We also noticed that the dog that had been attacked had no interest in getting far from the house. We talked about different ideas like fencing in a smaller area, but the dogs were energetic and they loved running. we decided to wait and see if anything else happened. It had been months without an incident, so we started cautiously letting them stay out longer again and not watching them every second. We were hoping it had been a freak occurrence, and for a while it seemed fine. And then one evening, a little before dusk, we heard them barking like crazy. We ran outside and called them in. At first they didn't come and stayed at the edge of our property, barking and growling at something we couldn't see. We kept calling them. It took a while, but eventually they did come in. That night I left my phone volume up. I don't know why, I just wanted to know if something was out there that particular night, especially if it was whatever attacked our dog. I couldn't sleep and kept alternating, watching out the window and keeping an eye on the security system app. By 1 a.m, nothing had come past, so I decided to go to sleep. Luckily, when the ding sounded, I was only half asleep. I shot up and grabbed my phone and looked at the video. I saw that dark blur again. Something was out there, I was sure of it. I woke my husband and he grabbed a baseball bat because that's all we had, and we went downstairs without turning on any lights. We looked out the back door window and watched for the black blur. We didn't turn on the light because we didn't want to scare anything away before we got a good look. It took about 10 minutes before we saw it, but there it was, big and dark, walking way down at the far edge of the property. And when I say walking, I mean walking upright like a person, not on all fours. It was so weird. We'd been expecting an animal, but wondered if it was a person after all. Maybe someone lurking around looking for stuff to steal. I had been sure that the thing that had attacked our dog was the same thing in the backyard, but now I was confused. Did we have a dangerous wild animal on the loose and a creepy guy? What were the odds of that? We kept watching and hoping to get a better look at the guy so we could tell the police something useful if we needed to. Eventually it came closer to the house, just close enough for us to see it in the moonlight, but we saw fur. Fur everywhere. The person or thing was tall, too, probably at least 7 feet, but covered in fur. It didn't make any sense at all. It started coming closer to the house, and if it came any closer, I could turn on the back floodlight and see it. It took a few minutes, but it did come close enough, and I reached over and flipped the light switch, flooding the backyard with light. The thing screeched and turned and ran, but not before we saw it clearly. We saw the tall, dark, furry face, and the body. And that horrible face, it was dog-like, with a canine-looking snout and long, sharp teeth. The worst part was the eyes, though, reddish-orange and glowing as it glared at us before running off. The thing had looked like a demonic dog person. We called the police and animal control, but once we explained that we definitely saw a dogman walking around with glowing eyes, they thought we were crazy. We even sort of thought we were crazy too. How could this creature really exist? We got a half-hearted promise from the police that they would search the woods and set some traps, but we could tell that they didn't believe us, and they never did come back. Luckily, neither has the dogman. At least, not yet.